The alarm on my desk screamed before I even opened my eyes that morning, and I knew, somehow, before I read a single word of the report, that the galaxy I understood had already ended. My name is Vex Thal. I am a delegate of the Ossimi people, and for 11 years I served on the Interstellar Council as a junior ambassador attached to the Human Liaison Office. I am telling you this story because I was there for all of it, from the first quiet warning to the last impossible sunrise over a fleet that should never have existed. I am not a soldier. I am not a scientist. I am only a witness, and what I witnessed still keeps me awake at night, though not for the reasons you might expect. It began on an ordinary session day, in the great debating chamber that floats above the neutral world of Cesarine. The chamber is a marvel, built by a dozen species working together, its walls alive with soft light that shifts color depending on the mood of the room. That day the walls were pale gold, calm, unremarkable. I remember thinking how strange it was that nothing in the architecture warned us. Nothing ever does, I suppose. Disasters rarely announce themselves with the right kind of lighting. The human delegation arrived exactly on time, as they always did. Their punctuality had become something of a quiet joke among the other species. A small human quirk we found endearing, in the way you find a neighbor's strict gardening schedule endearing. Ambassador Laura Bennett walked to the podium first, followed by two aides I recognized from prior sessions, Daniel Carter, and a younger woman named Elena Brooks, who rarely spoke, but always seemed to be listening harder than anyone else in the room. Laura Bennett was not a large woman. She stood perhaps a head shorter than most of the council members present, and her voice, when she used the translation array, carried none of the booming confidence some species associate with authority. She spoke plainly. She always had. That was, I would later understand, the most dangerous thing about her. "Council members," she said, and the room quieted the way it always did when a delegate opened with formality. "I have been asked to deliver a notice on behalf of the government of Earth and all affiliated human colonies." I remember leaning forward slightly. Notices were common. Trade adjustments, colony registrations, minor border clarifications. I expected nothing more than administrative noise, the kind of thing that fills half our sessions and empties the other half of anyone's attention. "Effective in 30 standard days," Laura Bennett continued, "humanity will withdraw all ships, all personnel, all embassies, and all commercial operations from Council space. This withdrawal is total and non-negotiable. We thank the Council for 2 centuries of partnership." For a long moment, nobody reacted at all. I think most of us assumed we had misheard the translation, that some fault in the array had scrambled her words into something absurd. Total withdrawal was not a policy. It was not a maneuver. It was the kind of thing you did before a war, or after losing one, and humanity was neither losing anything nor threatening anyone that we knew of. Councillor Prawn of the Velithi, an enormous being whose laughter shook the floor plates, was the first to respond, and he did so with laughter. Not cruel laughter, I want to be clear. The kind of laughter you offer when a child claims they will run away and live on the moon. Fond, dismissive, entirely misplaced. "Ambassador," Prawn said, still chuckling, "perhaps your translators have failed you. Withdrawal is a term used by defeated powers. Humanity is not defeated. Humanity has no rival capable of defeating it. What exactly are you withdrawing from?" Laura Bennett did not smile. She did not raise her voice either. She simply repeated herself, word for word, with the exact same calm cadence, as though she had rehearsed this moment so many times that emotion had been worn smooth out of it. 30 standard days, she said. "I am not here to debate the decision. I am here to inform the Council so that trade routes and dependent colonies can make appropriate arrangements." I did not laugh. I want that on record, because everyone else in that chamber will tell you they suspected something, that they felt a chill, that they knew from the start this was different. They are lying to themselves. I have reviewed the transcripts 100 times since. Nearly every voice in that chamber that day, across 17 species, treated the announcement as a curiosity, a diplomatic oddity, to be resolved with enough patience and enough questions. I did not laugh, but only because I had spent a decade watching humans up close, in ways most of the Council never bothered to. I had eaten meals with human engineers on trade stations. I had watched human children play games, with rules invented on the spot. and abandoned the moment they stopped being fun. I had also watched human diplomats during actual crises, during border disputes and resource conflicts that could have spiraled into violence, and I had noticed something the rest of the council seemed to miss entirely. Humans argued when they were uncertain. They negotiated, bargained, threatened, postured, and occasionally shouted, all when the outcome still felt open to them, when there was still a version of events they might be able to change through sheer force of words. But when a human stopped arguing, when the voice went flat, and the sentences became short and repetitive, that was not the sound of surrender. That was the sound of a decision already made, a door already closed, and nothing left to discuss, because the discussion had happened somewhere else, quietly, before anyone else was told. Laura Bennett was not arguing. She was informing us. And that terrified me more than any threat could have. I raised my hand, requesting the floor, and when it was granted, I asked the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Ambassador Bennett, I said, is humanity at risk? Is this withdrawal a response to a threat this council should be aware of? She looked at me directly. I remember the look because it was not cold, and it was not evasive. It was almost apologetic, the way you look at someone you like when you are about to disappoint them. I am not authorized to discuss the reasoning behind the decision, she said. I can only confirm the timeline and offer full cooperation during the transition. Full cooperation, as if this were a scheduling matter, as if 2 centuries of shared trade routes, shared defense agreements, shared science stations, orbiting a dozen contested worlds, could be unwound like a temporary arrangement, rather than the backbone many species had come to quietly depend on without ever admitting it. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices after that, each species reacting according to its own nature. The Velithi demanded formal justification, citing treaty clauses about advance notice for military repositioning. The Ithris delegation, always anxious about resource shortfalls, immediately began calculating how much of their food supply chain ran through human logistics networks. A representative from the Kolru cluster asked, with what I can only describe as genuine hurt in her translated voice, whether humanity was angry with the council, whether there had been some offense committed that could be corrected. Laura Bennett answered none of it with anything beyond her original statement, repeated, with slight variations depending on the question. Daniel Carter took notes throughout, his expression unreadable. Elena Brooks, the quiet aide, watched the room the way a person watches weather rolling in, tracking something the rest of us could not yet see. When the session ended, I did something I had never done before in 11 years of council service. I followed the human delegation out of the chamber, past the security escorts, into the private transit corridor reserved for diplomatic staff. I caught up to Daniel Carter near the transport bay, where the resonance dampeners made most conversations impossible to overhear, even for translation devices tuned to catch background sound. Daniel, I said, using his given name because we had shared enough casual meals over the years to earn that familiarity. Off the record, what is happening? He looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had known him, he seemed to be deciding whether our friendship, such as it was, meant more to him than his instructions. I can't tell you anything, he said finally. Not because I don't want to, because I genuinely don't know the full picture. Only a handful of people do, and none of them are field diplomats like me. Then tell me what you feel, I said. Not what you know, what you feel, watching this happen. He exhaled slowly, glancing toward the transport where Laura Bennett and Elena Brooks were already boarding. I feel like someone found something, he said quietly, something that made every argument we've ever had here, every treaty, every border dispute, look small. I feel like we're not being told to leave because we're angry, or because we're afraid of any of you. I feel like we're being told to leave because whatever is coming, it isn't going to care about council rules, and Earth doesn't want to be caught negotiating trade tariffs when it happens. When what happens? I asked, and I heard the edge in my own translated voice, something close to fear finally breaking through. Daniel Carter did not answer. He simply stepped onto the transport, the doors closing behind him with a soft hiss, and I stood alone in that corridor, surrounded by the hum of machinery built by species who had spent centuries assuming they understood their most powerful neighbor, only to realize in that instant that understanding and proximity are not the same thing at all. I returned to my quarters that night and did something unusual for someone in my position. I pulled every recording I had access to of human behavior during past crises, going back decades, long before I had joined the council myself. I watched human response teams during the Threndel mining collapse, when 300 non-human workers had been trapped and humanity had diverted an entire fleet without being asked, without seeking credit, arriving faster than any rescue protocol on record should have allowed. I watched human negotiators during the Kolru border dispute, patient for months, matching every provocation with calm words, right up until the moment they stopped being patient entirely and resolved the matter in 11 hours, with a decisiveness that left both sides of the original conflict too stunned to object. A pattern began to form in my mind, one I had sensed instinctively for years without ever articulating it clearly. Humanity did not behave like the other species on the council. Other species escalated gradually, each response proportional to the last, predictable in its rhythm. Humans absorbed and absorbed and absorbed, appearing almost passive by comparison, right up until some internal threshold was crossed that none of us could see from the outside, and then they acted with a suddenness and totality that left no room for negotiation, because the negotiating window, invisible to everyone but them, had already closed. I thought of Laura Bennett's flat, calm voice in the chamber. I thought of Daniel Carter's words in the transit corridor. Something made every argument we've ever had here look small. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the viewport of my quarters, watching the slow wheel of stars outside Caesarine's artificial orbit, and I found myself doing something I had not done since I was very young, back on my home world before I had ever left its atmosphere. I found myself hoping, quietly and without any real basis for the hope, that whatever Daniel Carter had almost told me was not as large as it had sounded in that empty corridor. The next morning, the reports began arriving from human-administered systems across council space, and hope, along with laughter, and along with every comfortable assumption the galaxy had built around the quiet, punctual, endlessly patient presence of humanity, quietly and permanently died. The first reports were small. A trade convoy that had run the same route between the Ithris cluster and the human colony of New Halden for 6 years, delivering refined ore in exchange for agricultural exports, simply did not arrive on schedule. This was, on its own, unremarkable. Convoys were delayed constantly by weather, mechanical failure, minor bureaucratic tangles at customs checkpoints. What made this delay notable was the message that followed it, sent not through diplomatic channels, but through the ordinary commercial network, addressed to the convoy's usual trading partners on the Ithris side. The message was brief. It stated that the New Halden Shipping Authority was suspending all outbound commercial activity, effective immediately, that existing contracts would be honored through automated payment systems already in place, but that no new contracts would be accepted, and no further shipments should be expected. It offered no apology and no explanation. It was signed by an administrator whose name none of the Ithris traders recognized, which was itself strange, because the previous administrator, a woman they had worked with for years, had always signed her own correspondence personally. Within hours, similar messages began arriving from other human-administered systems. Research stations jointly operated with the Velithi issued notices that all non-human personnel would be relocated to alternative housing outside the station within the week, with full compensation provided, but with no stated reason for the relocation. A shared defense outpost along the contested border with the Kolru cluster, staffed jointly by human and Kolru forces for over 3 decades, quietly reduced its human contingent by half, with the remaining personnel adopting a noticeably more formal posture toward their Kolru counterparts, according to reports that reached my office by evening. None of it was hostile. That was, perhaps, the strangest part of all. There was no aggression in any of these messages, no threats, no accusations. It was simply as though someone had gone through every human commitment across council space, with a checklist, quietly closing each item in order, methodically, without hurry, and without a single wasted word of explanation. I brought these reports to my superior, Ambassador Corvell, who had served on the council for nearly 3 decades and had personally negotiated several of the original trade agreements with Earth, back when humanity had first been granted observer status. I expected him to share my alarm. Instead, he waved a hand dismissively. the same gesture he used when junior staff brought him concerns he considered beneath serious attention. "They are consolidating," he said. "Every species does this periodically." Internal politics, budget reviews, domestic pressures we are not privy to. Humans have their own elections, their own internal disagreements. This will resolve itself within a season, and then everyone will wonder why they were so alarmed over routine administrative matters. I wanted to believe him. He had decades of experience I did not have, and it would have been comforting to accept his explanation and return to my normal duties, filing routine reports and attending routine sessions. But I kept thinking of Laura Bennett's face in the chamber, the almost apologetic look she had given me when I asked whether humanity was at risk, and I kept thinking of Daniel Carter's words in that empty transit corridor. Whatever is coming, it isn't going to care about council rules. That evening, against my better judgment and certainly against protocol, I contacted an old acquaintance who worked in the council's technical monitoring division, a Kohlru engineer named Petra Voss, who had spent years analyzing communication patterns across member systems for signs of coordinated military activity. I had helped her once, years earlier, with a translation dispute that had nearly derailed an important trade summit, and she had always said she owed me a favor. "I need you to look at something for me," I told her over a secure channel. "Human communication traffic, over the last 48 hours, across all systems. Not the content, I know you can't share that. Just the pattern. Volume, direction, anything unusual." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I worried the connection had failed. "I already looked," she said finally. "I looked this morning, before you called, because I noticed the same thing you probably noticed. Human commercial and diplomatic traffic across council space has dropped by 60% in 2 days. But here's the part that should concern you more. Internal human traffic, communication moving within human-controlled systems, toward Sol specifically, has increased by nearly 400% in the same window." "They're not going silent," I said slowly, understanding beginning to form like ice on a window. "They're going home." "That's what it looks like," Petra Voss agreed. "Every ship, every message, every resource that can be redirected towards Sol system is being redirected. It's not retreat in the way we'd recognize it. It's consolidation on a scale I've never seen from any species, let alone one that spent 2 centuries acting like it barely needed a unified command structure at all." I ended the call and sat alone in my quarters for a long time after that, turning her words over in my mind. Consolidation on a scale I've never seen. I thought of every human interaction I had witnessed over the years, every quiet, patient, endlessly reasonable diplomat, every calm engineer who solved impossible problems without ever seeming to raise their voice, and I began to understand, slowly, and with a growing sense of dread, that the galaxy had spent 2 centuries mistaking humanity's patience for its full capability, and that we were about to discover, whether we wanted to or not, exactly how much distance had always existed between the two. 30 days, Laura Bennett had said. 29 of them remained, and I found myself, for the first time in my long career on the council, genuinely afraid of what the remaining time would bring. The next 29 days passed like a held breath, and I spent every one of them watching the largest voluntary movement of ships in recorded galactic history unfold, with a quiet efficiency that unsettled me more than chaos would have. I want you to understand what a withdrawal actually looks like when a species has 2 centuries of infrastructure spread across hundreds of systems. It is not a matter of a few ships departing. It is factories, research stations, mining operations, embassies, hospitals, schools, entire towns built by human hands on worlds that were never originally theirs, all needing to be dismantled, transported, or abandoned within a single month. By every calculation my office ran, using models built by species with far more logistics experience than my own, the timeline Laura Bennett had announced should have been impossible. You cannot move that much mass, that many people, that much irreplaceable equipment, across such distances, in 30 days, without significant loss, without panic, without at least some fraction of the operation collapsing into disorder. And yet, I traveled, during those weeks, to 3 different systems, where human presence was being withdrawn, using my council credentials to secure passage on observation vessels sent to monitor the process. My first stop was New Halden, The agricultural colony whose shipping authority had sent that first strange, unsigned message to its Ithris trading partners. I expected to find confusion, overworked administrators, families scrambling to pack belongings onto overcrowded transports. Instead, I found something closer to a well-rehearsed performance. The colony's central plaza, when I arrived, was calm. Human workers moved through it with the unhurried efficiency of people executing a plan they had clearly practiced, or perhaps simply understood instinctively, after years of training I would never see. Children were led in small groups toward transport ships by teachers who kept them occupied with quiet games, the same kind of improvised, rule-shifting games I remembered from years of watching human children on trade stations. Except now, those games had a purpose beyond entertainment, keeping young minds calm and distracted while their entire world was disassembled around them. I spoke with a woman named Grace Whitfield, who had lived on New Halden for nearly 20 years and ran a small repair shop near the plaza's edge. She was loading tools into a crate when I approached her, her movements economical, her expression tired but not frightened. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, using the honorific I had learned was customary, "may I ask how you feel, leaving a home you built over 2 decades?" She paused, looking at the crate in her hands, then at the plaza around her, the buildings she had watched rise from empty ground, the streets she had walked more times than she could count. "I feel like someone I trust asked me to trust them a little further," she said finally. "That's all. I don't know the reasons. I wasn't given the reasons. But I've lived through enough to know that when the people running things stop explaining themselves and start moving fast and calm at the same time, it's usually because explaining would slow things down, at exactly the moment speed matters most." "Are you afraid?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, the way I noticed most humans did when asked something genuine rather than rhetorical. "I'm sad," she said. "Sad is different from afraid. I built something here. I'm allowed to be sad about leaving it, even if I understand why I have to." I left New Halden 2 days before the final transport departed, and what struck me most, reviewing my notes afterward, was the complete absence of anything I would call disorder. No riots, no desperate scrambling for limited transport space, no hoarding, no violence, no breakdown in the systems meant to keep people fed and safe during the transition. Every human I spoke with expressed some version of the same sentiment Grace Whitfield had given me. Sadness, yes. Uncertainty, yes. But an underlying confidence that the process itself, however strange and abrupt, was being handled by people who knew what they were doing, even if those people were not required to explain themselves. My second stop was the shared research station in Valithi space, where I had expected tension between the departing human staff and their Valithi colleagues, given how abruptly the relocation notice had arrived. What I found instead surprised me even more than the calm efficiency at New Halden. The station's senior human researcher, a soft-spoken man named Peter Hale, had organized what could only be described as a handover ceremony before his team's departure. Every piece of ongoing research, every dataset, every experimental protocol that the joint team had developed together over years of collaboration was compiled, documented, and formally transferred to the remaining Valithi staff, complete with detailed notes explaining not just what had been done, but why, anticipating questions that might arise long after the humans were gone. "You didn't have to do this," I told him, watching as boxes of physical backup drives, redundant even in an age of instantaneous data transfer, were carefully labeled and stacked for the Valithi team to review. "The notice only required relocation, not this." Peter Hale looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something crack in his careful composure, a flash of genuine grief quickly suppressed. "We've worked with these people for 6 years," he said quietly. "I don't know what's coming next, Ambassador, and I won't pretend I do. But whatever it is, I refuse to let it mean that 6 years of good work and good partnership just gets abandoned in a box somewhere, unexplained, because we were in a hurry. If this is goodbye, it's going to be a proper one." I did not know what to say to that. I still do not, entirely, though I have had considerable time to think about it since. My third stop was the defense outpost along the Kolru border, and here, finally, I found something closer to what I had originally expected, though not in the way I anticipated. The remaining human contingent, reduced by half as reported, had not become distant or formal out of coldness, as the initial reports had suggested. Instead, I found them working double shifts, training their Kolru counterparts intensively in every system, every protocol, every emergency procedure the joint outpost had developed over 3 decades of shared operation, as though preparing them not for a temporary gap in staffing, but for permanent independence. A young officer named Nathan Cross, who could not have been more than 30 years old by human reckoning, walked me through the outpost's defense grid personally, pointing out redundancies that had been added in just the past week, systems designed specifically to function without human oversight. "We're not just leaving," he told me, when I asked why the sudden intensity of training. "We're making sure that whatever this border faces next, it can face it without us, if it has to. That's not abandonment, Ambassador. That's the opposite of abandonment. That's making sure the door doesn't just close behind us. It leaves a working lock on the other side." I returned to Cesarine on the 27th day of the 30-day timeline, and I brought with me not the reassurance my superiors had hoped for, but a report that unsettled the entire council staff who read it. I had expected to document chaos, and instead, I had documented something that felt, in its own strange way, far more alarming. A species executing an impossible logistical operation, with total calm, total competence, and total unwillingness to explain itself, all while taking the time, even under this extraordinary pressure, to ensure that everyone they left behind was left in as good a position as possible. Ambassador Corvell read my report in silence, his expression shifting from mild interest to something closer to concern as he progressed through the pages. "This isn't retreat," he said finally, almost to himself. "Retreat looks like abandonment. This looks like preparation." "Preparation for what?" I asked, though I suspected, even then, that neither of us had an answer that would satisfy the question. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the window of his office, looking out over Cesarine's artificial skyline, the lights of a dozen species embassies glowing steadily against the darkness of space beyond the station's dome. "I served on this council when humanity first requested observer status," he said quietly. 2 centuries ago now. Do you know what struck me most about them? Even then, they asked more questions than they answered. Every meeting, every negotiation, they listened far more than they spoke. I always assumed it was diplomatic caution, a new species being careful among strangers. It never once occurred to me that perhaps they were simply gathering information the entire time, patiently, for 2 centuries, while the rest of us assumed we understood them because they were polite and quiet and always on time. I thought of Grace Whitfield's tired hands packing tools into a crate. I thought of Peter Hale's carefully labeled boxes of research data. I thought of Nathan Cross walking me through redundant defense systems built in a single week of frantic, focused effort. "They're not hiding weakness," I said slowly, understanding settling over me with the weight of something I had suspected for days, but had not allowed myself to fully believe. "They're hiding scale. All this time, we thought their patience was simply their nature. What if it was restraint instead? What if they've always had more than they ever showed us, and the only reason it never mattered before was that nothing had ever forced them to use it?" Ambassador Corvell did not answer, and his silence told me more than words could have. On the 29th day, the final human transports departed from the last handful of contested border systems, and council monitoring stations across a dozen sectors reported the same phenomenon simultaneously. Human communication traffic within council space dropped, within the span of a single hour, to 0. Not reduced, not quiet. 0. Every embassy channel, every commercial relay, every diplomatic back channel that had carried human voices for 2 centuries went silent at the exact same moment, as though a single switch somewhere in Sol system had been thrown, cutting the galaxy off entirely from a presence it had never fully appreciated until the instant it vanished. I stood in the observation deck of the council chamber that evening, watching the star field beyond Cesarine's dome, and I felt something I had never expected to feel about the departure of a species I had spent so many years working alongside. I felt the particular loneliness of realizing, all at once, how much unspoken support you have been standing on without ever noticing the foundation beneath your feet, and how strange and cold the air feels the first moment that foundation is gone. 30 days had passed exactly as Laura Bennett had said they would. Humanity had done precisely what it promised, no more, no less, with a precision that felt less like a political decision and far more like the execution of a plan that had been rehearsed for a very long time by people who had known, long before the rest of us, exactly how much time they had left to prepare for something none of us had even begun to imagine. The silence lasted exactly 11 days before the first cracks began to show, and I remember thinking, as I watched them spread, that we had all been living inside a structure held together by a support beam none of us had bothered to inspect, simply because it had never once failed us before. The Ithris cluster was the first to suffer visibly. Their agricultural economy, I would later learn from Petra Voss's monitoring reports, had grown quietly dependent on human shipping routes for nearly 60% of its export capacity, a figure that shocked even the Ithris delegates themselves when it was finally calculated in full. Without New Halden's convoys and the dozen other human trade lines that had crossed their territory for decades, warehouses of processed grain began accumulating with nowhere efficient to go, while the refined ore they had relied on receiving in exchange sat undelivered on the other side of a supply chain that no longer existed. I attended the emergency session where the Ithris ambassador, a normally composed woman named Sela Tarn, addressed the council with a barely controlled edge in her translated voice that I had never heard from her before. "We built our export economy around reliability," she said, gesturing at a projection showing collapsing trade figures across a dozen colonies. "We trusted the reliability because it had never failed in 60 years. We did not question it, because questioning something that always works feels like an insult to something that has only ever helped you. Now we are told, with 30 days' notice, that the reliability was never guaranteed to us at all. It was simply a courtesy that could be withdrawn." Councillor Prawn, whose earlier laughter in the chamber now felt like a distant, uncomfortable memory to everyone who had witnessed it, spoke next, his booming voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "The Velethi Defense Fleet has, for the past 4 decades, coordinated joint patrol routes with human vessels along 3 separate contested borders," he said. "Those routes are now unpatrolled on the human side. We are stretching our own fleet to cover gaps we did not know existed until the humans stopped filling them. I confess, with some discomfort, that I had never once calculated what percentage of our border security depended on a partner we assumed would simply always be there." I watched species after species stand and offer similar admissions over the following days, each one a small, painful acknowledgement of dependency that had gone unnoticed for years, even decades, hiding in plain sight behind the comfortable assumption of permanence. The Kolru cluster discovered that their shared defense outpost, despite Nathan Cross's careful training efforts, still left them with capability gaps in long-range detection systems that only human sensor technology had been providing. A research consortium spanning 4 different species discovered that nearly a third of their most advanced medical treatments relied on manufacturing processes developed and maintained exclusively by human pharmaceutical facilities that had gone dark along with everything else. What struck me most, sitting through session after session of these revelations, was not the scale of the dependency itself, though that alone was staggering. It was the tone in which each species delivered their admissions. There was no anger directed at humanity in these speeches, not really, though frustration and fear were present in abundance. Instead, there was something closer to shame, the particular discomfort of realizing you had built your entire framework of confidence on a foundation you never once thought to examine, simply because examining it had never felt necessary while it was working. I found myself, during this period, spending considerable time with Petra Voss, whose monitoring division had become one of the busiest offices on Cesarine, as every species scrambled to understand exactly how deep human infrastructure had run beneath the surface of galactic life. She showed me maps, during one of our meetings, that traced not just trade routes and defense patrols but subtler threads of dependency I had never considered. Human translation algorithms embedded in nearly every species' communication systems. Human-designed navigation beacons marking safe routes through several particularly hazardous nebula clusters, even human agricultural techniques, quietly adopted by a dozen colonies who had never credited the source because the knowledge had simply been shared freely, without fanfare, as one small courtesy among many. "They never asked for anything in return," Petra Voss said, tracing one such thread on the projection between us, a shipping lane through the Threndel debris field that only remained safe to navigate because of a beacon network humans had installed decades earlier and never mentioned again. That's what makes this so strange to map. Most alliances leave a paper trail of favors owed, debts tracked, reciprocity expected. Humanity's presence in galactic infrastructure reads less like an alliance and more like something a parent does for a household without ever bringing it up at dinner. You only notice it existed the day it stops. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward. The day it stops, it captured something essential about the 11 days of silence that followed humanity's withdrawal. A silence that revealed, more clearly than any negotiation or treaty ever could have, exactly how much of galactic stability had been quietly propped up by a species that had never once demanded credit for doing so. But dependency was only one dimension of what those 11 days revealed. The other, more troubling dimension, was what began to happen in the spaces humanity had left unguarded. On the 9th day of silence, a council monitoring station along the outer rim reported unusual activity near one of the abandoned human colonies, a small mining outpost called Pharaoh's Landing that had been quietly evacuated during the 30-day withdrawal. Its equipment left largely intact according to the original reports I had gathered during my visits. The activity was minor at first, sensor readings suggesting unauthorized vessels approaching the system, likely opportunistic scavengers hoping to claim valuable mining equipment left behind by a departed species. I did not think much of the initial report, assuming it to be a minor policing matter for whichever nearby patrol happened to be available. It was only later, once the full account reached my office through Petra Voss's monitoring division, that I understood how strange the resolution of that incident truly was. The scavenger vessels, according to sensor logs recovered afterward, approached Pharaoh's Landing, expecting an empty, undefended system. Instead, automated defense systems activated the moment their ships crossed a perimeter that had shown no activation for the past 9 days. Systems so precisely calibrated that they disabled the scavenger vessel's engines without causing a single injury to the crews aboard, before broadcasting a single automated message on an open frequency, a message that Petra Voss played for me during one of our meetings, her expression carefully neutral as she did. This system remains under monitored protection, despite the absence of resident personnel, the recording stated, in a calm, synthesized voice, utterly without malice or threat. Attempted unauthorized salvage will result in temporary vessel disablement, as demonstrated. No further consequence will follow. Please depart the system peacefully. Thank you for your understanding. I listened to that message 3 times before I fully absorbed what it meant. Humanity had not simply left. They had left behind systems designed to protect empty ground they had no immediate use for, with a courtesy and restraint that felt almost more unsettling than aggression would have. It suggested a level of foresight, resource allocation, and quiet capability that none of us had accounted for in any of our calculations about what humanity's true strength actually was. They planned for opportunists, I said to Petra Voss, after the recording ended. During 30 days of the most complex logistical operation any species has ever attempted, they still found the resources to build automated defenses for outposts they were abandoning, calibrated precisely enough to disable rather than destroy. That's not the part that concerns me most, Petra Voss said quietly, pulling up a different set of data on the projection between us. This is. She showed me a chart tracking Sol Systems' energy output, gathered from long-range astronomical monitoring stations that had continued watching the human homeworld even after diplomatic contact had ceased. The chart showed a steady, dramatic increase in detected industrial activity within Sol System over the 11 days since the withdrawal. Energy signatures consistent with massive shipbuilding operations running at a scale that exceeded anything humanity had ever demonstrated during its 2 centuries of council membership. They told us they were consolidating, I said slowly, remembering the word Ambassador Corvell had used weeks earlier. This isn't consolidation. This is mobilization. I don't know what it is, Petra Voss admitted. I only know it doesn't match anything in our historical models of human behavior, and that frightens me more than open aggression would. At least aggression tells you what a species wants. This tells us nothing except that whatever they're building it faster and larger than any prior estimate of their total industrial capacity would have predicted possible. I left that meeting deeply unsettled, and I spent the following days doing something that felt, in retrospect, like a small act of quiet rebellion against my own council's institutional complacency. I began compiling every fragment of information I could gather, official and unofficial, about the true nature of human capability, cross-referencing old research reports, old defense assessments, old trade agreements, searching for any prior indication that the galaxy had consistently underestimated exactly how much humanity had always been holding in reserve. What I found, piece by piece, painted a picture that unsettled me more than any single revelation could have on its own. Human shipyards, according to older reports filed decades earlier and largely forgotten since, had always maintained production capacity far in excess of what their peacetime fleet actually required. A discrepancy previous council analysts had attributed to inefficient human bureaucracy, rather than deliberate strategic reserve. Human research budgets, similarly, had always allocated substantial resources toward projects that never seemed to produce visible results within council-observed timeframes. Projects the previous generation of analysts had dismissed as wasteful human indulgence in speculative science, rather than what I now suspected they truly were: patient, long-term preparation for something the rest of the galaxy had never been told to expect. I brought these findings to Ambassador Corvell, late on the 11th day of silence, and for the first time since I had known him, I watched a senior council diplomat with 3 decades of experience read through a report I had compiled and simply sit in silence afterward, unable to offer the reassuring dismissal he had always relied upon before. "I think," he said finally, very quietly, "that we have spent 2 centuries mistaking a sleeping giant for a polite neighbor, Vexthal, and I think we are about to find out, very soon, exactly what woke it up." The council formed its emergency investigation committee on the 12th day of silence, and I was assigned to it not because of my seniority, which was modest at best, but because Ambassador Corvell insisted, over the objections of several more experienced diplomats, that my report on human capability had demonstrated exactly the kind of careful, patient attention to detail the committee would need. The committee itself was a strange assembly, drawn from 6 different species, each bringing expertise the others lacked. There was Petra Voss, of course, whose monitoring division had already proven invaluable. There was an elderly Velithi historian named Orin Thess, who had personally witnessed humanity's first arrival at the council 2 centuries earlier, and still maintained meticulous records of that early period. There was a young Ithris economist named Farah Doss, whose sharp analytical mind had already produced some of the clearest models of galactic trade dependency the council had ever seen. And there was, somewhat unexpectedly, a human specialist, a linguist, named Sophie Grant, who had spent decades studying human idiom and rhetoric, and had chosen, for reasons of her own, to remain on Cesarine, rather than return to Sol System with the rest of her species. Our task was deceptively simple in its stated form, and impossibly complex in its actual execution: determine why humanity had withdrawn, and determine what threat, if any, justified a response of this magnitude. We had 30 days to produce a preliminary report, though privately, none of us believed 30 days would be nearly enough. We began, as investigations often do, with the archives, and it was Orin Thess who first suggested we look further back than any of us had initially considered necessary. "You are all treating this as a recent development," he said, during our first full committee session, his voice carrying the particular patience of someone who had watched many crises unfold and resolve over a very long life. "I suspect it is not recent at all. I suspect whatever drove this decision has been building for a very long time, and the withdrawal itself is simply the moment the preparation finally became visible to the rest of us." He directed us toward records from humanity's earliest years as council observers, a period so distant that most current diplomats had never bothered reviewing it in detail, assuming, reasonably enough, that 2-century-old diplomatic transcripts held little relevance to a present-day crisis. Orin Thess had been present for those early sessions, however, and he remembered details that had never made it into official summaries. There was a research station, he told us, established early in humanity's council membership, jointly funded, but staffed almost entirely by human personnel, ostensibly studying deep space phenomena along the galactic rim. I remember it because the funding request was unusual, disproportionately large for the stated scientific goals, and because human representatives were notably evasive whenever questions arose about its specific research focus. At the time, I assumed it was simple bureaucratic inefficiency, the kind every species exhibits when managing long-term projects. I no longer believe that was the case. Petra Voss located the station's records within a day, buried in an archive that had not been accessed in over a century. The station, designated only by a technical serial number rather than any memorable name, had operated continuously for the entire span of Humanities Council membership, its funding renewed automatically through a standing agreement that no one had thought to question in decades. Its official research focus, according to the initial funding documentation, was the study of background radiation patterns along the galactic rim, a legitimate but modest scientific pursuit that would ordinarily have justified a small fraction of the resources this station had quietly consumed over 200 years. "This is not a radiation study station," Farados said, after reviewing the resource allocation records for several hours, her voice tight with the particular frustration of an economist confronting numbers that refuse to make sense according to their stated purpose. "The power requirements alone are absurd for passive radiation monitoring. This station has been drawing energy consistent with active, continuous, high-resolution signal detection across an enormous range of frequencies. Someone built the most sophisticated listening post I have ever seen the records for, and they hid it inside a funding request boring enough that nobody would ever think to ask what it was actually listening for." "Listening for what, though?" I asked, staring at the station's listed coordinates on the projection between us, a location far along the galactic rim, well beyond any contested border, well beyond any region of active council interest, and listening in what direction? It was Sophie Grant, the human linguist, who answered that question, though not directly. She had been quiet for most of the session, listening rather than contributing, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the rest of us turn toward her immediately. "I need to tell you something," she said, "that I have known for some time and never shared, because I did not believe it was relevant to my work, and because sharing it felt like a betrayal of trust I was not certain I had the right to break. I think it is relevant now." She explained that years earlier, during a research collaboration with a human academic named Henry Cole, a specialist in what he had described only vaguely as signal pattern analysis, she had encountered a passing comment that had stayed with her ever since, precisely because of how quickly he had changed the subject after making it. "We were discussing linguistic patterns in ancient human mythology," she said, "specifically recurring themes of watchers from the sky, old stories found across nearly every human culture, describing something vast, observing humanity from a great distance, waiting." Henry made an offhand remark that these stories might not be purely symbolic. He said, and I remember this precisely because it unsettled me even then. "The old signals never really stopped, you know. We just got better at pretending we couldn't hear them anymore." Then he changed the subject entirely, and when I tried to raise it again in a later conversation, he behaved as though the comment had never been made. The room fell silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Oren Thess, who had lived through 2 centuries of council history and had seen more strange fragments of information than any of us, was the one who finally broke the silence. "The old signals," he repeated slowly. "A listening station along the galactic rim, disguised as a radiation study, operating continuously for 2 centuries. I do not think these things are unrelated, and I do not think humanity's sudden, total withdrawal is unrelated to either of them." We spent the following days attempting to gain access to the listening station's actual research data, a task that proved far more difficult than any of us anticipated, given that the station itself, like every other human facility, had gone completely dark following the withdrawal. What we did manage to recover, through painstaking archival work and Petra Voss's considerable skill at reconstructing partial data fragments from old transmission logs, was a general sense of where the station's sensors had been pointed for the majority of its 2-century operation. It was not pointed toward any council territory. It was not pointed toward any known hostile species, of which there were admittedly few, given the general stability the council had maintained across its member systems for generations. It was pointed toward a vast, largely empty stretch of space between 2 spiral arms of the galaxy, a region so devoid of stars, so lacking in any resource or strategic value, that no council survey mission had ever bothered mapping it in detail. Why would you spend 2 centuries and enormous resources listening to nothing? Farah Das asked, staring at the projected coordinates with an expression of genuine bewilderment. Because it was not nothing to them, I said slowly, understanding beginning to form with the particular clarity that comes from finally seeing a pattern you had been circling without recognizing, or because they suspected it would not remain nothing forever. I thought of Daniel Carter's words in that transit corridor weeks earlier, words that had haunted me ever since. Something made every argument we've ever had here look small. I thought of Henry Cole's fragment about old signals never stopping. I thought of Sol System's sudden, dramatic increase in industrial output, mobilization on a scale that made no sense for a species simply reorganizing its internal affairs. They found something out there, I said, gesturing at the empty coordinates on the projection. Something they've been watching for 2 centuries, patiently, quietly, without ever telling the rest of us it existed, because telling us would have meant admitting they were watching for a threat none of the rest of us had the instruments or the imagination to detect ourselves. Orenthes nodded slowly, his ancient eyes fixed on the projection, with an expression I can only describe as grim recognition. And now, he said quietly, whatever it is close enough, or imminent enough, that they no longer believe they have the luxury of continuing to watch from a distance, while pretending, for our comfort and their own convenience, that nothing was ever there at all. We submitted our preliminary findings to the full council 3 days later, and I remember the particular quality of the silence that met our report. A silence very different from the dismissive laughter that had greeted Laura Bennett's original announcement weeks earlier. This silence carried the weight of an entire chamber finally beginning to understand that the species they had spent 2 centuries treating as a polite, quiet, occasionally useful partner had, in fact, spent that same 2 centuries quietly standing guard over something none of the rest of us had ever known needed guarding, and that whatever it was, it had finally grown close enough, or dangerous enough, that the guard had been forced to abandon every other commitment in order to face it directly. I did not sleep well in the days following that presentation. I found myself, more than once, standing at the observation deck of Cesarine's chamber, staring out at that same distant stretch of empty space between the spiral arms, wondering what exactly humanity had been listening for all those years, and whether the rest of the galaxy would survive long enough to find out the answer for ourselves. The invitation arrived 18 days after our committee submitted its preliminary findings, and it arrived in a form none of us expected, a direct message from Sol System itself, the first communication humanity had sent to the Council in nearly 6 weeks of total silence. The message was brief and precise, much like everything else humanity had communicated to us since the withdrawal began. It stated that a small delegation, no more than 5 individuals, would be permitted to travel to Sol System under strict guidelines, to observe conditions there directly, and report back to the Council. It specified that the delegation should be drawn primarily from the investigation committee already assembled, suggesting, uncomfortably, that humanity had been monitoring our work far more closely than any of us had realized during weeks of supposed total silence. I was selected for the delegation, along with Petra Voss, Sophie Grant, Farah Das, and a Kolru defense analyst named Julia Ford, who had been added specifically to assess any military capability we might observe. Orenthes, given his advanced age, remained on Cesarine to continue coordinating our research from the archives, though I could see in his expression, when we departed, a longing to witness whatever we were about to find with his own eyes. The journey to Sol System took 9 days aboard a council transport vessel, and I spent most of that time in a state of anxious anticipation I found difficult to manage even with the considerable diplomatic training I had accumulated over 11 years of service. We knew almost nothing about what awaited us. Our sensors, as we approached human space, registered a level of activity that unsettled even Julia Ford, whose professional composure had survived considerably more alarming briefings than most. "I am reading defense platforms at every approach vector," she said, on our 6th day of travel, studying the sensor readings with an expression of carefully controlled unease. Not just at Sol System itself, along every route leading toward it. Layered detection grids, automated response systems, redundant coverage that would take most species decades to construct even with unlimited resources. "Ambassador, I do not believe humanity built any of this in the 6 weeks since the withdrawal began," You think it already existed, I said, though it was not really a question. I think, Julia Ford said slowly, that we are looking at defensive infrastructure that has been under construction for a very long time, perhaps decades, kept quiet, and unremarkable enough that our own long-range surveys never flagged it as unusual, and only now activated, expanded, and brought to full operational readiness, because the moment finally called for it. We arrived at the outer edge of Sol System on the 9th day, and I remember the specific, disorienting shock of the sight that greeted us, a sight that none of my 2 centuries of accumulated council briefings on human capability had prepared me for in the slightest. Sol System was not simply defended, it was transformed. Where I had expected to find the modest, familiar human fleet I remembered from council trade convoys and diplomatic escorts, ships built with a practical, understated efficiency that reflected humanity's general diplomatic demeanor, I instead found shipyards operating at a scale that dwarfed anything I had witnessed in any other council member system, including the considerably larger and more industrially focused Velethi homeworld. Vessels under construction filled the space around several of the system's moons, their hulls in various stages of completion, their sheer size and number suggesting an industrial capacity that no prior council assessment had ever come close to estimating accurately. "This is not possible," Farados said quietly, staring at the sensor readings with the particular disorientation of an economist confronting numbers that violated every model she had ever built. "This level of production would require resource extraction, refining capacity, and labor allocation orders of magnitude beyond anything humanity has ever reported to the Council. Where is all of this coming from?" Our transport was met, as we entered the system's inner regions, by a small human escort vessel, and I felt a strange, unexpected relief when I recognized the woman who greeted us aboard the connecting shuttle that carried us the final distance to a modest space station orbiting Earth itself. It was Elena Brooks, the quiet aide who had accompanied Laura Bennett during that first announcement in the council chamber, weeks earlier, though she carried herself now with a confidence and directness she had not shown during that earlier meeting. "Ambassador Vex Thal," she said, extending a hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Thank you for coming. I know this has not been an easy journey, in more ways than one." "Miss Brooks," I said, "I confess, I have a great many questions." "I know," she said, and something in her expression, tired but not unkind, suggested she had been anticipating this conversation for a very long time. "You'll have most of them answered soon. Ambassador Bennett asked me to bring you and your colleagues directly to her, once you had a chance to see the shipyards for yourselves. She said seeing them first would make the explanation easier to accept." She was right, though I did not fully appreciate how right, until we had spent several more hours touring select portions of Sol System's industrial capacity, always accompanied, always guided carefully along routes that revealed enough to convey scale, without revealing details Elena Brooks indicated remained classified even now. We saw shipyards where vessels emerged in numbers that suggested production timelines measured in days rather than months. We saw research facilities where scientists worked with an intensity and focus that reminded me uncomfortably of Peter Hale's careful handover of research data weeks earlier, except magnified across a scale that made his quiet dedication at that single station look almost modest by comparison. We saw, most unsettling of all, training facilities where what appeared to be enormous numbers of young humans moved through exercises with a discipline and coordination that suggested years, not weeks, of preparation, a discipline that made Julia Ford's professional composure crack, briefly, into something close to alarm. "How long," she asked Elena Brooks, as we observed one such facility from a secure viewing gallery, "has this been running?" Elena Brooks did not answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice carried none of the evasiveness I might have expected, only a kind of tired honesty that suggested she, too, had spent a long time waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. "Longer than any of you are going to be comfortable hearing," she said, "but that's not really my story to tell in full. Ambassador Bennett is waiting for you now. I think it's time you heard the rest from her directly." We were escorted, following that exchange, to a modest office aboard the orbital station, unremarkable in its furnishings, notable only for the enormous viewport dominating one wall, through which Earth itself was visible, blue and quiet, and utterly unlike the frantic industrial activity surrounding it throughout the rest of the system. Laura Bennett stood at that viewport when we entered, her posture the same calm, unhurried stillness I remembered from the council chamber weeks earlier, though something in her expression, when she turned to greet us, carried a weight that had not been present during that earlier, more formal encounter. "Ambassador Vexthal," she said, "and colleagues, thank you for making the journey. I imagine you have questions." "We have seen your shipyards," I said, choosing my words carefully, aware that Julia Ford, Farah Doss, and Sophie Grant were all watching this exchange with equally intense attention. "We have seen production capacity that exceeds every prior council assessment of human industrial ability, by a margin that defies explanation. We have seen training facilities operating at a scale that suggests years of preparation rather than weeks. I believe, Ambassador Bennett, that the time for careful diplomatic phrasing has passed. What is humanity preparing for?" Laura Bennett was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting briefly to the viewport behind her, to the quiet blue world hanging silently amid the industrial storm surrounding it. "2 centuries ago," she said finally, "when humanity first requested observer status with your council, we already knew something the rest of the galaxy did not. We had detected a signal, faint and ancient, originating from a region between the spiral arms that your own surveys had never bothered to map, because there was nothing there worth mapping, as far as conventional instruments could tell. That signal did not behave like natural background radiation. It behaved like something searching, slowly and patiently, moving in a direction that our earliest calculations suggested would eventually bring it into contact with inhabited space, though the timeline, at the time, seemed comfortably distant, centuries away at minimum." "The listening station," I said quietly, understanding settling into place with the particular clarity of a puzzle, finally completing itself, along the galactic rim, disguised as a radiation study. Laura Bennett's expression flickered with something close to surprise, quickly replaced by a tired, almost relieved acknowledgement. "You found it," she said. "I'm impressed, and I confess, somewhat grateful. It means I won't have to explain everything from the very beginning." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "We joined your council not merely to participate in galactic affairs, Ambassador, though I want to be clear that the friendships and partnerships we built over these 2 centuries were genuine, valued, never merely transactional, despite what I imagine you must be thinking right now. We joined, in large part, because we needed access to the resources, the trade networks, and eventually the shipbuilding capacity that council membership provided, all of it directed, quietly and patiently, toward a single purpose we never once mentioned to any of you, because mentioning it would have required admitting we were preparing for a threat that, for 2 centuries, remained distant enough that action still felt premature." "Until now," Sophie Grant said quietly, and Laura Bennett nodded. "Until 3 months ago," she said, when new data from that same listening station indicated the signal's approach had accelerated dramatically, its trajectory now placing first contact with inhabited space within a time frame measured in months rather than centuries. "We had built considerable capacity and reserve over 2 centuries of patient preparation, Ambassador Vexthal, but we had never built it at the scale this new timeline demanded. 30 days was not chosen for dramatic effect. It was the minimum time our logistics teams calculated we needed to consolidate everything, every resource, every trained individual, every ship, back to Sol System, in order to begin producing what this new timeline actually requires." I stood in that quiet office, Earth glowing softly beyond the viewport, and felt the full weight of 2 centuries of careful, patient, quietly extraordinary human restraint finally settle into clear focus. Humanity had not withdrawn from the galaxy because it had lost interest in the Council, or because some internal crisis had consumed its attention. It had withdrawn because it had spent 2 centuries standing guard over something none of the rest of us had ever known to fear, and the guard, finally, could no longer maintain the pretense of ordinary diplomatic life, while that threat drew close enough to demand every resource humanity possessed. "What is it?" I asked quietly. "The signal. What is actually coming?" Laura Bennett's expression, for the first time since I had known her, showed something I had never before seen from any human diplomat across 11 years of service. Genuine, unguarded fear, quickly steadied, but not entirely hidden. We don't fully know, she admitted. We know its trajectory. We know its scale, based on the strength and consistency of the signal across 2 centuries of observation. We know it is not natural, and we know, based on patterns our researchers have spent decades analyzing, that it is not simply passing through. It is coming here, Ambassador, deliberately, and we believe, though we cannot yet prove with certainty, that it has been coming for a very long time, long before humanity ever developed the instruments capable of detecting it. The silence that followed her words felt different from every other silence I had witnessed during the preceding weeks of crisis and revelation. It was not the silence of shock, or disbelief, or dismissive comfort. It was the silence of an entire small group of individuals, drawn from 6 different species, finally understanding that whatever the Council had assumed about the shape and danger of the galaxy it inhabited, that understanding had always been incomplete, and that the true scale of the danger facing all of us had been quietly, patiently, and necessarily hidden from view by the one species among us who had known enough to be properly afraid. We returned to Caesarine 11 days later, and I have never in my career carried a heavier burden of knowledge back to a waiting council chamber than I did on that journey, knowing that everything we had witnessed in Sol System would need to be explained to an audience that had, only weeks earlier, laughed at the very idea that humanity might have reasons beyond our understanding. Laura Bennett traveled with us, along with a small technical team led by a quiet, precise researcher named Alice Turner, who had been part of the original team monitoring the listening station along the galactic rim for nearly 15 years. Where Laura Bennett's first appearance before the Council had been brief, deliberately withholding, this appearance we all understood would need to be entirely different. The chamber was full when we arrived, fuller than I had ever seen it, word having spread across every council system of the delegation's return, and the promise of answers long overdue. Ambassador Corvell greeted me quietly before the session began, his expression carrying none of the dismissive confidence I remembered from our earliest conversations weeks before. "I have spent 30 years on this council," he told me, "and I have never once felt as unprepared for a session as I do right now. Tell me honestly, Vexthal, should we be afraid?" I considered the question carefully, remembering Laura Bennett's unguarded expression in that quiet office aboard the orbital station, the fear she had allowed to surface only briefly, before steadying herself once more. "I think," I said, "we should be grateful that someone was watching, even if it means learning, all at once, how much we never knew to watch for ourselves." The session opened with Councillor Prawn, his booming voice notably subdued, formally inviting Ambassador Bennett to address the chamber. She approached the podium with the same measured calm I had come to recognize as fundamentally, irreducibly human, though I now understood that calm carried a weight the rest of us had never fully appreciated. "Council members," she began, 11 weeks ago, I stood before you and delivered a notice that many of you, understandably, found difficult to accept without explanation. I want to begin by apologizing for the manner of that notice, though not for the decision itself. I am here today to provide the explanation I was not, at that time, able to give." She gestured, and Alice Turner activated a projection at the center of the chamber, displaying data that Petra Voss's monitoring division had helped compile into a form the entire assembled council could understand. 2 centuries of signal observations from the hidden listening station, condensed into a single, sweeping visualization that traced a slow, patient, deliberate approach from the empty space between the galaxy's spiral arms toward the heart of inhabited territory. 200 years ago, Laura Bennett continued, humanity detected an anomalous signal originating from this region, a region your own surveys had correctly identified as empty of any stellar bodies worth studying, and therefore never examined closely. We built a research station specifically to monitor it, disguised as a modest study of background radiation, because we did not yet understand what we were observing, and because premature disclosure of an unconfirmed threat, drawn from instruments and analysis your council had no independent way to verify, seemed more likely to cause panic than preparation. The chamber remained silent, hundreds of delegates from dozens of species listening with an intensity I had never witnessed during any prior council session, not even during the most contentious trade disputes or border negotiations of my career. "For nearly 2 centuries," she went on, "that signal behaved consistently with our earliest models, distant, slow-moving, its eventual arrival calculated in centuries rather than years. We used our time as council members not merely for diplomacy and trade, though those relationships were genuine and valued, but to quietly build the industrial and scientific capacity we believed we would eventually need, patiently, without alarm, integrated so thoroughly into our ordinary economic and scientific activity that it never once appeared as unusual military buildup to any external observer. Alice Turner stepped forward at this point, her precise, careful voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent 15 years staring directly at the data she was now sharing. 3 months ago, she said, we detected a significant change in the signal's behavior. Its approach accelerated dramatically, its trajectory sharpening toward a direct and imminent arrival within Council space, timeline now measured in months rather than centuries. More concerning still, the signal's structure changed in ways consistent with what our analysts believe indicates active, directed intelligence rather than a passive natural phenomenon. Whatever is approaching, it is not simply drifting toward us. It is coming, deliberately, and it appears to be accelerating that approach specifically now, for reasons we do not yet fully understand. A ripple of alarmed murmuring moved through the chamber at this revelation, quickly quieted as Laura Bennett resumed speaking. We do not know, with certainty, what this signal represents, she said. We do not know its intentions, its capabilities, or its true nature, beyond the fact that it is not natural, and it is not passive, and it is approaching faster than any of our models anticipated even a few months ago. What we do know is that humanity spent 2 centuries building the capacity to respond to exactly this scenario, and that our withdrawal was the necessary final step in converting 2 centuries of quiet preparation into an actual, mobilized defense capable of meeting whatever arrives. Councillor Prawn rose slowly from his seat, his earlier laughter now a distant memory that seemed to weigh on him visibly as he spoke. Ambassador Bennett, he said, why come to us now? You withdrew from this council entirely. You could have continued your preparation in isolation, allowing the rest of us to remain unaware until the threat, whatever it is, made itself known on its own terms. Laura Bennett's expression, when she answered, carried something I had not seen from her before. A genuine, unguarded openness that felt like the true unveiling of everything her careful diplomatic calm had spent 2 centuries concealing. Because whatever is coming, she said, is not a threat any single species should face alone, no matter how much quiet preparation that species has managed over however many centuries. We built our capacity assuming we might need to face this threat by ourselves, because we did not know, when we began, whether the rest of the galaxy would believe us, even if we tried to explain. But 2 centuries of partnership with this council taught us something we did not fully expect to learn when we first requested observer status, that facing a threat of this magnitude alone, when allies exist who could stand alongside us, is not caution, it is waste. We are here, council members, not merely to explain our withdrawal, but to ask whether the partnerships we built over 2 centuries, partnerships I know some of you have only now begun to fully appreciate the depth of, might extend one step further, into something none of us have ever attempted together before. The silence that followed her words was unlike any I had witnessed in 11 years of council service, unlike even the stunned quiet that had greeted her original withdrawal announcement weeks earlier. This silence carried the particular weight of an entire assembled body of species, each proud in its own way, each accustomed to negotiating from positions of careful self-interest, confronting the possibility that survival itself might now depend on setting aside every old habit of caution and suspicion in favor of something far more difficult, genuine, complete trust in a partner whose true capabilities they had never fully understood until the exact moment those capabilities became necessary for everyone's survival. Ambassador Corvell was the first to break that silence, rising slowly from his seat beside me, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard from him during 3 decades of council service. 30 years ago, he said, I helped negotiate humanity's original observer status agreement. I remember thinking, at the time, that we were doing them a favor, extending trust and partnership to a young species eager to join a galactic community far older and more established than their own. I understand now how foolish that assumption truly was. You did not need our favor, Ambassador Bennett. You extended us the favor of your patience, for 2 centuries, while quietly standing guard over a danger none of the rest of us ever knew existed. I do not know what capabilities this council can offer that would meaningfully add to what you have already built. But I know that whatever we have, whatever any of us have, should be offered freely and immediately, because a debt of 2 centuries of unacknowledged protection is not one any of us can repay through caution or hesitation now. One by one, delegates across the chamber rose to echo similar sentiments, each species offering, in its own manner, whatever resources, capabilities, or support it believed might contribute to facing a threat that suddenly felt far larger and far more immediate than any border dispute or trade disagreement the Council had ever navigated before. I watched Councillor Prawn offer the full mobilization of the Velithi defense fleet. I watched Sela Tarn, still visibly shaken from the economic devastation her cluster had suffered during the silence, nonetheless pledge every agricultural resource the Ithris people could spare toward sustaining a joint mobilization effort. I watched species after species, proud and self-interested under ordinary circumstances, set aside old habits in favor of something that felt, for the first time in my career, like genuine, unified purpose. Laura Bennett stood at that podium, watching the chamber respond, and I saw, in her expression, something that had been entirely absent during our first encounter weeks earlier. Relief, quiet and profound. The particular relief of someone who had carried an enormous, solitary weight for far longer than she had ever expected to, finally allowed to share that burden with others, willing to help carry it forward. The council did not merely stand in astonishment that day, though astonishment was certainly present, etched into every face across that crowded chamber. It stood, for the first time in its long history, in the recognition that the greatest threat any of us had ever faced would require setting aside 2 centuries of comfortable assumption, comfortable dependency, and comfortable ignorance, in favor of a partnership built not on convenient trade agreements or careful diplomatic caution, but on the far more difficult foundation of complete, unguarded trust between species who had, until that very moment, never truly understood one another at all. 6 months have passed since that session, and I am writing this account from the observation deck of a vessel I never imagined I would board in my lifetime, a joint command ship built from Velithi structural engineering, Ithris life support systems, Kolru navigational arrays, and a human command architecture at its core, all integrated into a single working whole through months of frantic, unprecedented cooperation between species who had spent 2 centuries working alongside one another, without ever truly building anything together at this scale before. The mobilization that followed Laura Bennett's testimony was unlike anything recorded in Council history, and I do not say that lightly, given how much history I have personally studied during my years of service. Every species that had once treated humanity's departure as a curious administrative matter now poured resources into a joint effort that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. Velithi shipyards, among the largest in Council space, retooled their production lines to match specifications shared, for the first time, directly by human engineers, specifications that Alice Turner personally helped translate into terms every allied species could implement within their own industrial base. Kolru defense analysts, including Julia Ford, worked alongside human counterparts to integrate detection networks, combining human sensor technology, honed over 2 centuries of quiet vigilance, with Kolru tactical planning, refined over generations of border conflict management. Ithris agricultural systems, still recovering from the economic devastation of the silence, nonetheless found new purpose supplying the enormous logistical demands of a fleet larger than any single species had ever attempted to build alone. I spent much of those 6 months serving as a liaison between the joint command structure and the broader council, a role that required me to translate not merely language but temperament, helping species accustomed to careful, gradual negotiation adjust to the far more urgent, decisive pace that human military planning demanded, while helping human commanders understand the particular sensitivities and communication styles of allies they had spent 2 centuries observing from a respectful diplomatic distance, but had never truly worked alongside under pressure. Grace Whitfield, whom I had met during New Halden's evacuation months earlier, rejoined the effort as well, her practical engineering skills proving invaluable in adapting salvaged colony equipment for use aboard the growing joint fleet. I encountered her again during a supply inspection 3 months into the mobilization, and she greeted me with the same tired but steady composure I remembered from that first meeting in her half-packed repair shop. "Strange, isn't it?" she said, as we walked together through a cargo bay filled with equipment drawn from a dozen different species' manufacturing traditions, somehow functioning together despite their wildly different origins. "A few months ago, I was packing up my whole life because someone I trusted asked me to. Now I'm building something bigger than anything I ever imagined, alongside people I never expected to work with directly. I don't know what's coming, Ambassador. None of us really do, not fully. But I feel less alone facing it than I did watching those transports leave New Halden, and that counts for something." Peter Hale, the researcher I had met at the Velithi Joint Station months earlier, now led a combined scientific team studying the approaching signal directly, drawing on data from the original hidden listening station alongside instruments contributed by 4 other species, each offering perspectives and detection methods humanity's isolated 2-century vigil had never had access to before. Nathan Cross, the young officer from the Kolru border outpost, now commanded a joint patrol wing that included Kolru pilots he had personally trained during those frantic final days before the withdrawal, pilots who now flew alongside human counterparts with a coordination that spoke to the depth of preparation he had quietly built into what everyone had once assumed was simple staff reduction. The signal itself, as of this writing, remains an object of intense, ongoing study rather than immediate confrontation. Alice Turner's team, now working alongside researchers from every major council species, has refined the timeline considerably since Laura Bennett's original testimony, though the picture that has emerged offers little comfort. Whatever approaches us moves with clear purpose, its trajectory unwavering despite 2 centuries of distance, its structure suggesting an intelligence and capability that none of our combined technology can yet fully characterize. We know it is coming. We do not yet know, with certainty, what it wants, or what it will do when it arrives. What we do know, and what I find myself reflecting on often during quiet moments aboard this vessel, is how thoroughly this crisis has reshaped the galaxy's understanding of itself. I think often of Ambassador Corvell's words in that crowded chamber, his admission that humanity had extended us a gift of patience for 2 centuries, that none of us had ever properly recognized or valued, until the moment it was withdrawn. I think of Sela Tarn's shame at discovering how deeply her people's prosperity had depended on a partner they had never bothered to examine closely, simply because that partner's support had always been reliable enough to go unquestioned. I think of Counselor Pran, whose booming laughter at Laura Bennett's original announcement now feels, in retrospect, like the sound of an entire galaxy's comfortable, untested assumptions about its own strength and self-sufficiency. I do not know what awaits this joint fleet when we finally reach whatever is approaching from that empty stretch of space between the spiral arms. I do not know whether 2 centuries of quiet human preparation, now joined by 6 months of desperate, unprecedented allied cooperation, will prove sufficient to meet a threat that none of us fully understand even now. What I do know, standing at this viewport watching a fleet built from a dozen species' combined effort and expertise move into formation ahead of us, is that the galaxy which existed before humanity's withdrawal no longer exists, and I do not believe it ever truly can again. Laura Bennett walks past my position on the observation deck as I finish these thoughts, pausing briefly beside me, her gaze following mine toward the assembled fleet ahead. "Ambassador Vexthal," she says, "still recording your observations, I see." "Someone should," I tell her. "I suspect whatever happens next will be remembered for a very long time, by whoever remains to remember it." She is quiet for a moment, watching the fleet, and when she speaks again, her voice carries none of the careful, guarded calm I remember from our first meeting in that council chamber so many months ago, only a tired, honest hope that feels, in its own way, more human than anything I witnessed during 2 centuries of careful diplomatic observation. "For 200 years," she says, "we carried this alone because we did not know how else to carry it. I am glad, Ambassador, more glad than I can properly express, that we do not have to carry it alone any longer." I think of the council chamber's pale gold walls on that first ordinary session day, so many months ago, when nothing in the architecture warned us that the galaxy we understood was about to end. I think of laughter that has since gone quiet, of dependencies quietly revealed, of a species that spent 2 centuries standing patient guard over a danger the rest of us never knew to fear. I think of Grace Whitfield's tired hands, Peter Hale's careful handover of research data, Nathan Cross's frantic final days of preparation, each small act of quiet decency carried out, even amid the largest, most urgent mobilization any of us had ever witnessed. The galaxy humanity departed no longer exists. In its place stands something new, forged not from convenient alliance or careful trade agreement, but from the harder, more honest recognition that survival, in the end, depends not on how much any single species can build alone, but on how willing we all are, finally, to stand together, unguarded and unafraid, against whatever waits for us in the dark space between the stars. This is where my account ends, for now, though I suspect it marks not a conclusion, but only the beginning of a story none of us yet know how to finish. The fleet moves forward. The signal continues its patient, deliberate approach. And I remain here, at my post, recording, watching, and hoping, alongside every species now bound together by a truth we can no longer afford to ignore, that whatever comes next, we will finally face it as one.